we are Laurent Fintoni, and the next work, the next presentation is Scholarly Primitives, Revisited, Building a Taxonomy of Scholarly Digital Objects.
I'll take a note.
Okay.
Thank you. It's actually Scholarly Primitives Revisited again, and that will be relevant, so it's all good. Hi, everyone. I'm just going to share some insights from a 3-year project that finishes this month, actually, during which we developed, amongst other things, a taxonomy of scholarly digital objects. And the goal of this presentation is to kind of offer reflections on this work and kind of what we might do with it as a field. So start with the project itself, which is called NOT. As an aside, seeing as we've had anagrams conversations today, there's not an anagram of anything. So the project in brief was a 3-year pilot. It was tasked with investigating ways to showcase the digital cultural heritage of Italian universities and find ways to integrate it into a new national infrastructure, and was a collaboration between the Ministry of Culture and the University of Bologna. Now, from this premise, what we did is choose to focus our central argument not on the traditional digital cultural heritage that people might think about, e.g. digitized objects, but instead on what we saw as an interesting yet unexplored example of digital cultural heritage in the form of the objects that are created by academic research, hence our tagline of rethinking scholarly digital objects as cultural heritage. Project produced a bunch of things I'm sure you're familiar with. We had a data model, we have a catalog, we have a knowledge graph, and we have 2 semantic artifacts, a thesaurus and a taxonomy, the latter of which is the focus of the presentation. So next, I wanted to kind of define scholarly digital objects in the context of both the project and this talk. This is a term that we settled on very early in the research, thanks in no small part to Francesca Tomasi, who kind of seeded the term into my head. It basically builds on existing definitions of digital cultural heritage, including, for example, the UNESCO definition, definitions from the Italian Ministry of Culture, and research and critical work in the heritage sector. And in essence, what SDOs are is kind of 2 categories of objects: collections of information and digital forms that enable interaction with information. So now I'm sure many of you will be familiar with these 2 categories. Cover everything from data sets and databases to platforms, digital editions, endpoints like API, Viz tools, etc. And the argument here is that there is heritage value in these objects that is basically largely ignored. And this value includes things like the activity that produced them, the relationships that they have to encoded information, so the relationships that enable to encoded information, and the new contexts that they make possible for this information and the potential for the acquisition of new knowledge. So to close this introductory part, I wanted to quote from Fiona Cameron's work, which was super useful for me when I was kind of figuring all this out. In her 2021 book, The Future of Digital Data, Heritage and Curation in a More Than Human World, she calls for a shift in thinking from digital objects as data towards a new form. And I quote, "Central to a change in the practice of digital cultural heritage is a shift in thinking from the digital object as data, as information and materiality, to a form that is multi-agential and distributed, spatially and temporally continuous and extended, and that operates in a unique rhythmic fashion involving a proliferating number of coordinates and multiple forms of rationality." And this is basically central to what we tried to do, which is to argue for the cultural value of the objects that research creates, but also importantly to make that argument by saying this is not just data, it's more than that. And this is also relevant to how we've tried to organize these objects. So I'd like to return to the title of this presentation, which I'm pointing to the again thing, because the title of my presentation is a reference to a 2014 paper presented at the ADHO conference. There was itself a reference to a 2000 paper by John Unsworth, and it is here in 2025 because who doesn't enjoy a good meta reference? So what are scholarly primitives? Well, Unsworth is credited with seeding the idea in reference to processes employed by literary scholars. Here's how he explained it in his 2000 paper. "I'm using the term primitives in a self-consciously analogical way to refer to some basic functions common to scholarly activity across disciplines over time and independent of theoretical orientation. This idea proved particularly useful and interesting to others, basically as a way to identify common low-level scholarly activities in various humanities disciplines and how they connected to different kinds of tools. One project that this inspired was the development of a taxonomy, which some of us may know today as TADIRA, which is the taxonomy of digital research activities in the humanities. So a little over a decade after Unsworth's paper, a group of researchers borrowed the term for their own presentation in which they introduced TADIRA. And in that presentation, they pointed to the goal of the taxonomy as, and I quote, to construct a lightweight basic taxonomy of higher order goals and first order methods that can be easily expanded in all directions by linking lower order techniques to multiple goals and or methods to create machine readable paths amongst the various resources. It's not a very sexy quote, but basically the point here being that you can see how they're trying to build on work that came before, which basically leads me to the next thing, which is Tadira today has proven particularly successful in the DH as a way to organize information basically related to research. We make use of it in our data model. And I think a big part of Tadira's success has been that it built on previous work, but it also used community feedback. So in this slide, what I want to do is kind of give you a brief summary of what happened in the last 20 years in the DH when it comes to trying to organize what people do in the digital humanities, so methods and activities, some of which are directly kind of related to Tadira. So we begin in the 2000s. We have TAPOR, which is probably the only project that's still alive today. We had the artshumanities.net taxonomy of computational methods in the arts and humanities from Oxford. Following decade, we moved the DH Commons, which is a continuation of artshumanities.net. We have the directory in the US. We have the Daria DE portal and a short-lived project called Teresa at the end of the decade, first version of Tadira, and a spin-off Tadira called Nedima. And then we moved to our current decade, where we have the latest version of Tadira, which essentially switched it from an ontology to a SCOS encoded vocabulary, like a proper taxonomy, so to speak. We have the topics and methods registry in the reviews in the digital humanities publication. And then most recently, about 2 years ago, Stanford CESTA Center rolled out a taxonomy of DH methods and approaches. And ultimately, what all these efforts have in common is basically an attempt by the community to organize information related to the projects, like how are they conducted, what tools do they use, what do these projects focus on. In the context of our project, however, we were looking at the objects that the research created. So that left us with a kind of key observation, which is that while there have been efforts to create useful taxonomies of methods, tools, and activities, less focus appears to have been given to the objects that these methods, tools, and activities might produce. And so ipso facto, we had to develop our own taxonomy, both due to this observation as well as the needs of our project. I'd just like to point out that some of you may know Tadira did in its earlier instances have a list of objects. However, these were objects used in the process of research rather than the objects that were created by the research. We developed the taxonomy in the first year of the project in parallel with our data model and catalog. The list of terms was drawn from a census of Italian humanities projects. It's formatted as a very simple hierarchical structure. Definitions are taken from existing authority controls, national standards and research. Library of Congress, Getty Thesaurus, Italian standards. But the goal was to basically allow definitions to encompass both the accepted usage as well as the practical usage, which, as we all know, may well be in conflict. And the technical development was most influenced by Tadira. We used SCOS for the encoding, and then we used open source software called Cosmos to make it available. It's available via a web frontend and an API, and these latter two elements ensure that the taxonomy is fully fair. So in this slide, you can see a screenshot of what a taxonomy looks like on the interface. On the left side, you see the hierarchy, which, as I mentioned, is kind of fairly simple. We have a total of 22 terms, and only a handful of terms have children. And this was kind of a direct reaction to Tadira, actually, a very early decision in the development process to keep things flat. Because Tadira, whilst great, is organized around 7 top-level concepts, underneath which there are, I think, 160 concepts. So it makes usage kind of tricky. And then this is an example of a page for a term within the taxonomy. So we have the definition, we have relations to concepts both within and outside the taxonomy, sources for the definitions, and examples taken from our census. So I'd like to close by returning to the title of the presentation. In the course of developing and implementing the taxonomy, we kind of came to reflect on this idea of scholarly primitives and how it helped to drive the evolution of work, research, and thinking around activities and methods. Our taxonomy is intended as a base for ongoing reflection regarding the meaning, definitions, and usages of the objects that this research creates. So taking a cue from the rethinking of methods and activities as scholarly primitives that motivated the creation of Tadira, I kind of wanted to propose the following open-ended question to all of us as a field of researchers, academics, and thinkers. And the question is, what could be achieved by working on the definition of a set of primitives for scholarly digital objects? Such primitives could reflect the core types of objects that our research creates, covering both established functions and practical uses. It could provide a common ground to reflect on not just how we do research, but what it produces, how these results sometimes differ, how they're similar, and how they can and should be cared for. And again, returning to earlier mentions of insights from the heritage sector, I think this would be useful not just within the field, but also outside of it. Now, obviously, such a proposal is not without challenges. We can't always have nice things. So like, how do we account for the messiness of practice versus the rigidity of definition? A key example that we were faced with throughout this process is digital archive, right? Like, what's a digital archive as a digital object? And where does it fit between the traditional definition of an archive and the practical usage of the word in our field and outside of it? Related to this, what are the infrastructural contexts? In our case, we focus primarily on the Italian experience. And in fact, the Italian experience is deeply impacted by the infrastructure of Italian academia. Like, what Italian academia allows you to do or tells you to do or how it tells you to do it directly impacts the types of objects that are created, what they're called, how they're used, and even how they're maintained. And then related to this, obviously, is how do we account for the instability created by funding? As I'm sure many of us know, so much of DH research has both benefited from and been hurt by the vagaries of research funding. And this is even more relevant in our current kind of global political context. And it impacts not just what types of objects are created, such as, for example, influences from external trends, but also whether they are maintained or not. Now, obviously, we have potential answers or responses to these questions. The first and most obvious, which was used by Tradera, is community engagement. Allowing the thing that we do to evolve with the needs and desires of the community, letting it be flexible. We weren't able to do the similar type of community engagement that Tradera did. However, in the past year, another Italian project that also focuses on DH objects made use of our taxonomy. And from their usage, we've had some interesting conversations about what new terms to add. So for example, I've had an ongoing conversation about what to do with the objects that are created by machine learning processes. It's another kind of similar example to digital archives. Another potential solution is the need for clear documentation of both origins and regular revisions, something we implemented early on alongside an editorial process. But the goal here is basically to make any taxonomy that you create, to make the logics of the taxonomy legible across time. And then lastly, there is the need to confront biases and technological implications. I think the latter is particularly relevant and has risen in importance with the increasing dominance of generative AI, both within academia and outside of it. And so to finish, I'd like to close by repurposing a quote, just like I repurposed the title. This is from a recent paper by Jennifer Giuliano and Laurent Steele, where they looked at the usage of Tradera in digital humanities conferences, where it's sometimes used to organize reviews. And in that paper, towards the end, they call for the following: further analysis of how we name and connect our disciplines can only enrich our scholarship and represent its complexity and nuance more appropriately. And I'd just like to say the same thing, but replace disciplines with objects. And that's me. Thank you. Oh, and it's a bunch of links where you can find the stuff.
Okay, thank you, Laurent. So we have to move on some questions.
Very much. I'm looking at the taxonomy and I'm just wondering why is the description limited to humanities research? Because I think it could be much broader and applicable.
Sure.
Yeah,
that was the limitation of the project more than anything. Yeah, very much. I think about this much wider, but certainly my personal thinking when we started doing this was we could apply this to everything. It was a very naive and hopeful thing. I was new to academia, but so I've restricted it back just to be realistic. But yeah, no, I think my original goal is ultimately this applies to everything. We talk a lot about papers, right? You mentioned this in your presentation. It's like, at the end of the day, academic work is really, I think, as a broad generalization, valued by like these kind of traditional outputs like papers and conference presentations and things like that. But I think the objects have an incredible value, have a much bigger public value, and we totally ignore them. And to the best of my knowledge, after 3 years of research, like nobody has ever tried to organize the objects in any meaningful way outside of like, this is a digital collection, this is a digital library, this is a digital archive. And in the Italian context, what we found most commonly is I created this thing and I'm using seemingly 3 random words, like a database, a knowledge graph, and I don't know, there's one that's like a knowledge graph, but they're calling it a digital library. And the document, and then the documentation is also suffers, as we all know. Again, it's a byproduct of the work, and so you're left with all these things where it's like, this is interesting, but I can't make heads or tails of it because. And Tadira, I think, showed that we can make heads or tails of, for example, how we do the research, right? So it's kind of like really this kind of thing here that I was saying. Where is it? Yeah, this has been in my head for 3 years, which is like, what if we did this, but we just looked at objects instead of activities? Because I think we could all benefit from it. No.
More interdisciplinary projects.
Right.
If you can roll it out over more disciplines, that then also helps.
Yeah.
To each other.
In this case, in our catalog, in the case of our project, we have covered, there's quite a few projects in the catalog that are interdisciplinary, in that a big part of the effort with the census was we looked at the DH, but we actually looked at the humanities, with the DH being kind of subset of it. So there's a few interesting projects that we came across that are, for example, in Italy at least, quite a few archaeological related projects have made use of what they call DH approaches. And it's very much kind of a meaningful example of that. So I think, yes, to go back to your point, you could expand this out. We narrowed it just because, again, it's the thing, you have to kind of narrow it, otherwise we're swimming in the soup. Thank you.
Other questions? Actually mentioned the fact that you want to go broader than only that field, so you go to other fields. You had mentioned this in the last slides. You also mentioned the fact that now, like, it's only restricted to the Italian academia, right?
Sure.
What do you think? How will this change when you move to other domains? Let's say,
Okay.
Other academies.
Yeah. So the Italian restriction is the byproduct of the project, being that we had to look at the Italian system. But in general, in our experiences, even talking to other people, I think largely the terms that we came out with are probably broadly applicable, certainly in Europe. But I think, again, some of the examples that I gave, like in North America, my understanding is, again, the focus is still primarily on activities. So like they organize things by either what was the subject of the research or what was the method of the research, which is totally valid. It's just that sometimes you might be like, oh, I would love to look at examples of like a digital library, just to use a random example.
So they focus on the same things, you think?
Yeah, but if I do that and I go to, for example, reviews in the DH, which is a publication that reviews DH projects, I can't just be like digital library, show me all of it. I'd have to think about maybe what kind of activities, or I just have to search digital libraries and then I'd find a bunch of stuff, depending on how their search engine is organized, right? It's just a byproduct of that. But I think some of it applies broadly. Obviously, in the Italian context, for example, digital edition has placed a prominence in our taxonomy because, as we've pointed out, there's a strong philological element in Italy. That might be less the case in other places. Thank you.
It was very insightful. When it comes to updating the taxonomy, do you have a specific procedure, a specific workflow? Do you have a specific team, maybe? I was just curious about it. Thanks in advance.
Thank you. The team is me. But I mean, technically, yes, there should be a security team. So when we developed the taxonomy and the thesaurus, I used so Tadira as a reference, but also the Getty handbook, which was written as a byproduct of them developing the Getty thesaurus. And in that handbook, one of the things they call for is to make sure that when you build a semantic artifact, you should ensure that there's an editorial process in place for how you might want to update that artifact. So we developed an editorial process which we used internally, but by and large, the process is so you can go on the website and kind of look at it. I don't remember the top of my head, but there's this idea of, this other project, Atlas, has used that taxonomy, and out of that use, one thing that came out is like, what do we do with the products of machine learning projects, right? So like, what's the model? Like the model data set, all of these things. And so the first step of our editorial process is to have kind of these conversations and think about, can we slot this under an existing term? Like, could we meaningfully say that not the model part, but say the training set part of a language model is a data set. I believe we could. So technically that term already exists. And then you're left with, okay, so what do we do with the model part of it? And so that's kind of the process. But we've used it internally. So one of the things we added is controlled vocabulary, for example, which I built a controlled vocabulary and then didn't even think about putting the term controlled vocabulary under the thing that I had built. Because we came across projects that built controlled vocabularies, and the controlled vocabulary is not the same as an ontology. But we had ontology at the beginning because, again, the terms were drawn from a census. So looked at a bunch of projects, we're like, they've done this, 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 and this. We should probably start with this list of terms. And then we kind of went from there. But the process is basically, it's documented on the website. It's a fairly simple editorial process of like, at least questioning whether or not, again, it's this thing of how granular do you want to go? So Atlas, for example, wanted to be more granular about about digital editions. We didn't. So they built their own taxonomy of digital editions so that they could have that granularity. And I think that's also another, it's another thing about linked open data and kind of the open web. Like, we don't necessarily need my proposal of a thing. It doesn't need to be everything for everybody, but it could be like the base from which, I'm going to need to build like a version. And I think there's examples of that, like DCAT is a really good example of a thing that everybody uses and that then has offshoots. So they recently did a DCAT offshoot for large language models, which is not part of the DCAT model. It's just an application profile that you can use if you're using DCAT. And I think that kind of approach is probably best suited to that, because ultimately everybody has a different opinion about what you should do with, the object that they created.
Okay, thank you, Laurent. If there is no other questions. Okay, thank you again.
Thank you.
We move to the next presentation.